Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, Your Excellencies, it's a pleasure to chair this session and the panel discussion about 150 years of international use of the metric system. This invitation honors my institution, Observatoire de Paris. Indeed, as we will hear from the first speaker, the first definition of the meter as the 1/10 millionth of the distance between the pole and the equator is based on measurements of the meridian conducted from astronomers at Observatoire de Paris since its foundation, and especially the measurements made over 7 years during the French Revolution by astronomers Delambre and Méchain. This meridian Paris goes all through the Observatoire de Paris in the middle of our historical building. As the unit of length, the meter, you have been told this morning that it is defined by taking the fixed numerical value of the speed of light in vacuum. And the first demonstration that the speed of light is finite was published by the Danish astronomer who worked in France at that time in Journal des Savants, the Journal of Academy of Science in 1676, based on observations of the satellites of Jupiter made by himself and Picard at Observatoire de Paris. Nowadays, metrology of space and time and frequency is always a central activity in Observatoire de Paris. We are in charge by decree of producing and disseminating the French legal time. And I must read it. This decree from it was from the version for 2017. The first line of the decree is vu la Convention du Mètre signée à Paris le 20 mai 1875. This is, you know, the usual considering. And then it says. Dans le cadre de la coordination de la métrologie française et des règles fixées par le BIPM, Bureau international des poids et mesures, pour l'établissement du temps universel coordonné, l'Observatoire de Paris est chargé d'établir la valeur locale de l'UTC et de la fournir aux utilisateurs. So, you see that at Observatoire de Paris, a lot of our work is under Convention du Mètre and under BIPM. I must say also that our atomic clock makes a strong contribution to the international atomic time, and we are making a lot of research to improve the standards and our clocks. And I'm very proud that we are part of the experiment that has been sent to International Space Station, ACES. It has been sent 4 weeks ago. And it composed of two clocks, and one of these, Pharaoh, is very dear to our teams. It's called Atom Clock. However, I must confess that in general, astronomers have a distant, complex relationship with the metric system. This may be due to the huge range of distances, times, and masses that you encounter in astrophysical context. We use to measure the distance from the planets to their host star, use astronomical units. We could have used gigameters, but we did not. And the distance to external galaxies is given in megaparsecs or gigaparsecs. We use magnitudes, a logarithmic scale, to measure the brightness of astronomical objects in the visible and infrared domains. But radio astronomers, you know, it's like when you had different units to measure the same thing in distant towns, even close towns. And here you have the towns of optical astronomers, they use magnitudes, and then you have the town of radio astronomers, they use Jansky's. And sometimes it's very difficult to understand each other. I hope sometimes it will improve. Despite this somewhat ad hoc use of the metric system, astronomers are well aware that a common system of units is essential. They all remember the famous loss of Mars Climate Orbiter, this robotic space from NASA, who was lost in 1999 because it encountered Mars in a trajectory that brought it too close to the planet, and it was destroyed in the atmosphere. The investigation attributed the failure to a measurement mismatch between two measurement systems, the SI units, metric by NASA, and the US customary units by the spacecraft builder, of which I will not be giving the name. This was really a stupid tragedy. I've been personally involved in a NASA Mars mission called InSight, which in 2018 landed a seismometer on the ground of Mars. The industrial prime contractor of the InSight mission was the same as that of Mars Climate Orbiter. And believe me, from the very beginning of the mission in the years 2010, it was decided that everybody from the industry in the US to the instrument providers in France, but also UK, would use SI unit. And this was checked several times. However, if you look at the NASA communication to the general public about InSight, they still use both systems of units. So we have three panelists in this session. The first one will be Professor Alder, which will give us a keynote address. The second speaker will be Dr. Duan from the National Institute of Metrology in Beijing. He will be in a video conference, I think. And then the last speaker will be the director of the BIPM, Dr. Martin Milton. If we have time, we should have a session of question and answers from the audience. So be prepared. Prepare your questions, your burning questions. We should be able to take a few questions. So our first speaker will be Professor Alder, which is Professor of Humanities of History at Northwestern University, and the central theme of his work is the history of measurement. I think that's a good subject for this audience, both of nature and of human beings, and the many ways in which quantitative values reflect social values. Ken Alder's second book, The Measure of All Things, examined the origins of the metric system in revolutionary France. This book has been translated into 12 languages and won 3 Best Book prizes. He also won a prize for traduction for the best translation in France. He has also published books on the origin of modern engineering in the French Revolution and the history of America's obsession with the lie detector. Very interesting portfolio. So I now call Professor Alder, if you want. The scene is yours.
Bonjour, messieurs et mesdames, et bien retour à l'après-midi de nos séances fêtant le 150e anniversaire de la Convention du Mètre et la fondation du Bureau international des poids et mesures. Apologie que je donne mon discours en anglais, même si l'histoire et l'événement dont je raconte roulaient largement en France et en français. Mais en tant qu'histoire, je me sens très honoré d'être parmi vous, mes chers métrologues. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the afternoon sessions of our gathering today. We assemble today to honor the 150th anniversary of the Metre Convention of 1875 and the founding of the Bureau International of Poids et Mesures. It is fitting that we are holding this convention in its honor because it is a convention that we honor. That's more than a pun. As I will explain in my remarks today, it is only when we gather, when we meet to iron out our differences, that we are able to forge the kind of consensus that makes metrical conventions, metrical standards, stick. It's true that the organizers of such conventions tend to hold them in beautiful settings, in Paris, for instance, which has seen its share of such gatherings. This has sometimes led skeptics to dismiss these assemblies as boondoggles or junkets or empty formalities, but this is to misunderstand their value. Such agreements have a long history and serve an essential and noble cause. The history of standardized measures begins in the early 21st century. That's the 21st century BCE. When the world's oldest surviving law code, the oldest law code of which we have a record, the Ur-Nammalud Code, was promulgated in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. The code opens with a preface which invokes the gods and praises the king for establishing equity throughout the land. And how had the king ensured the fair administration of justice? According to the preface, by standardizing the kingdom's weights and measures. Not only had he defined the mina as the realm's unit of weight, he divided the mina into 60 shekels so that its weight in silver could serve as a currency. He also set the standard silo, ration bowl, as compensation for a day's labor, and extended this quantitative logic to the rest of the laws. No longer was punishment to be meted out an eye for an eye. Henceforth, it would be a half mina for an eye. Just measures would guarantee equal justice. As the preface concludes, the orphan was not delivered up to the rich man. The widow was not delivered up to the mighty man. The man of 1 shekel was not delivered up to the man of 1 mina. The problem, of course, was this royal decree, like those which followed, did not endure. Our standards of measurement define who we are and what we value. We speak their language whenever we exchange information with precision or trade objects with transparency. To do their job, standards must operate as the shared conventions against which we strike agreements and make distinctions. This very ubiquity, however, tends to make measurement invisible. People generally consider measurement banal and only notice measurements when the standards themselves vary by time and place. This was certainly the case in old regime France, when under the cover of about 800 different names for units, there were in fact 250,000 different units of weights and measures in daily use. As Professor Phillips pointed out, they tended to be physical objects located either in a church or a manor house or a guild house, and they differ from town to town and from profession to profession. Sometimes it's really true that a pound of feathers might weigh less than a pound of lead. Some of these other measures, though, served a very important social purpose. They regulated local trade and custom. For example, there was a measure of cloth that was the width of the local looms. Or fields were measured by what we would call volume, by bushels of grain. How much grain did it take to sow that land? Or vineyards were measured in days. How many days would it take to pick the grapes? This diversity preserved local control of trade and norms of labor, but it baffled travelers, stifled long-distance commerce, and frustrated the equitable administration of the state. As one Englishman traveling the countryside of France remarked on the eve of the French Revolution, the infinite perplexity of measures there exceeds all comprehension. That is why, on the eve of the French Revolution, when the French people were asked to list their grievances in the famous cahier de doléances, thousands of French municipalities asked their leaders to create a uniform set of weights and measures. The challenge for the National Assembly then was, what sort of uniformity would they create? The French Revolution may have begun as a national revolt, but its leaders had universal aspirations. While some legislators did want to impose Parisian units on the nation, the creators of the metric system proposed a different solution. Instead of measures valid for a single nation, they would turn to nature, which was the same for all. After consultation with members of the Academy of Sciences, They define the meter as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator. And you may ask why that particular definition? Well, it's because it came out about that long. They did want a unit that was on the human scale and very close to an old definition of actually a width of cloth, an un. As Condorcet put it, and as the motto of this conference proclaims, the new measures would be pour tous les temps, pour tous les peuples, for all time and for all people. And so the French authorities reached out to other nations to help them in this project. Unfortunately, the Revolutionary Wars of that era ended all talk of collaboration, and it was France alone which dispatched 2 astronomers to perform this task. In 1792, Delambre and Méchain were sent north and south respectively to measure the length of the meridian arc that runs from Dunkirk to Barcelona with the goal of extrapolating from that distance to the full quarter arc by measuring the latitudes of the 2 endpoints. So this is the triangulation that they made of France in the era. The larger section by Delambre had been measured in the past, and so it was the longer one. The southern section, which had not really been measured before, was given to Méchain. It was a mission of awesome responsibility. In June 1793, Antoine-Laurent Lavoisier, the founder of modern chemistry and actually the chair of the Academy's Committee for the Reform of Weights and Measures, wrote to Méchain, then surveying in the south. He wrote, this is in French, but I will read in English, "You must not forget that you are carrying out the most important mission that any man has ever been charged with, that you are working for all the nations of the world, and that you are the representative of the Academy of Sciences and all the savants of the universe." Talk about shifting the burden of Atlas onto someone else's shoulders. For the next 7 years, the 2 savants surveyed the territory, slowly measuring their way towards one another. They climbed cathedral towers, volcanoes, and fortresses. They crossed battle lines, survived life-threatening injuries, and were threatened by peasants who mistook them for spies or land surveyors, which is in a sense exactly what they were, until at last they returned to Paris to present their data to an international scientific conference of the most illustrious savants of France and its allied nations, who together calculated the length of the meter. In 1799, this calculation was embodied in a platinum étalon, a standard bar, which then became the world's first universal standard of measurement. Over the next decade, their achievement was then written up by Delambre in his book Base du système métrique, which you see here, and accepting a volume of this book in 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte, by then Emperor of France, declared, "Conquests will come and go, but this work will endure." Or so the familiar story goes. Indeed, you can see here on the title page of Delambre's own copy of his own book, he had written in the margins there these words of Napoleon. That's how we know they were said. And that book somehow, this particular volume of this particular book actually left France 100 years ago under somewhat mysterious circumstances and ended up in a private museum in Southern California, where I finally tracked it down. And in the margins of the book, I found not only this comment, but many other comments, many other changes in the data, many other corrections and addendum, including a note from Delambre indicating that he had placed the records of the metric expedition, his own logbooks, as well as those of Méchain, on deposit in the archives of the Observatoire de Paris, just in case anyone wanted to verify his account. Well, history, like the natural sciences, is a discipline based on empirical research. So I decided to visit those archives to see what they contained. That's where they are to this day. Delambre's notebooks, I discovered, are classics of their type. Bound volumes, numbered pages, written in ink, signed and dated at the bottom of each page. Méchain's logbooks, however, look nothing like this. They consist of loose leaves of paper, written in pencil, unsigned, often undated, then pasted by Delambre into a larger logbook where he retraced them in ink and provided annotated comments. And at the end of one of the last of these collage notebooks, I found this note by Delambre. I will read in English. Because I have not told the public what it does not need to know, I have suppressed all those details which might diminish its confidence in such an important mission, one which we will not have a chance to verify. I have carefully silenced anything which might alter in the least the good reputation which Monsieur Méchain enjoyed for the care he put into all his observations and calculations. Well, what details had been suppressed? Why silence anything which cast doubt on Méchain's measurements? The answer lay in other documents in the archives, letters between Delambre and Méchain, letters which Méchain had begged his colleague to burn after his death, letters which Méchain had instead placed under seal. Méchain was the son of a plasterer from the town of Laon, who had by dint of meticulous labor become a naval cartographer and a comet hunter. He was a cautious man, a family man with 3 young children, and his scrupulousness was born of self-doubt. Méchain had begun his expedition by measuring his way south from the Pyrenees to Barcelona, where he spent the winter of 1792 measuring the latitude of the city by taking 10,000 observations from the fortress of Montjuïc. This work done, Méchain mailed his data to Paris and was preparing to return to France to measure the triangles there when 2 disasters struck in quick succession. First, war broke out between revolutionary France and royalist Spain, and the Spanish authorities forbade him to leave the country. And then second, he suffered a freak accident. He was visiting a mechanical pumping station, and he was literally struck in the chest violently by one of the arms of the machine. It sent him into a coma for 3 days. He suffered massive injuries, and he went to convalesce in a hotel in the center of town. But to prove that he was still being useful to the project, he decided to confirm his previous measurements of the latitude and took another 10,000 measurements from the courtyard of his hotel. Imagine his horror when he discovered a discrepancy greater than he could account for even after correcting for the distance from Montjuïc to his hotel. How could he return to France and say the meter might be this or that long? Already back in Paris, several illustrious savants, Lavoisier among them, had been executed by guillotine. So Méchain made a fateful decision. He decided to suppress the second set of data and keep the knowledge of the discrepancy secret. Then abruptly, Spanish war policy changed, and he was forced to leave Barcelona and return to France. But there, the secret discrepancy began to torture him. He slowed his labors, making almost no progress on his triangles. His letters became melancholic. Several mentioned suicide. He took refuge in an abandoned monastery in the Montagne Noire and refused to continue the mission. Back in Paris, Delambre and his colleagues tried desperately to get him to finish the expedition, until at last they hit upon an ingenious solution. They sent his wife down to fetch him. This, though, was a brilliant move because Madame Méchain was an incredibly competent and skilled astronomer herself. In fact, she had done all his continuing observations at the observatory while he was away on mission and continued to get paid in his name. And in fact, this was a very common practice in the old regime. Many of the operations of science were family businesses, and alike, just like being a goldsmith was. And the entire family was involved, though the man would get credit as the public figure, no surprise. The women as mothers or sisters or daughters did much of the labor and contributed enormously to this project. There were more women scientists, you could argue, in the 18th century than there were until the late 20th century. And in fact, that's not just in proportion, that's even in absolute terms in certain fields like astronomy. Something to think about. The professionalization actually in the 19th and 20th century largely excluded women until much, much later in the century. So though her name does not appear anywhere in the logbooks, it is Madame Méchain who helped complete the meridian triangles. When Méchain returned to Paris, though, he still hadn't told a soul about the unreported data from Barcelona. I think he told his wife, and he told one astronomer in Italy, which is how we know about it at the time. Extracting uniformity from nature, as I don't need to tell this audience, is no simple task. And enlisting other nations to join in that common endeavor can be more difficult still. The happy paradox is that the solution to these two problems go hand in hand. Collaboration turns out to be the best assurance of reliable metrology, and reliable metrology is the best inducement to collaboration. For the past 150 years, the Bureau International des Poids et Mesures has labored to bring this dual project to fruition. The seeds of that project were planted at the world's first two international scientific conferences, both devoted to creating the metric system in the first place. The first took place in 1798 in the little duchy of Germany, Duchy of Gotha in Germany, where a dozen European astronomers met to calibrate their instruments and hear the French astronomer Joseph Jérôme Lalande preach the virtues of the metric system. They also took in an excursion to the residence of the Duchess, where they drank champagne, danced till dawn, and fired several cannon which shattered the windows of the chateau. And here you can see Lalande and his illegitimate daughter, who was the workhorse of his very famous career as an astronomer and did much of the calculational work on his behalf and all the organizing of the conference. The second conference was far more consequential. Later that year, the French government invited a dozen of their allied leading scientists to Paris so that the astronomers from Denmark, Holland, the Italian states, Spain, and Switzerland might work alongside their French colleagues to convert Delaunay-Méchain's meridian data into a single value for the meter. It was this assembly of savants which discovered another discrepancy. As the great physicist Enrico Fermi would say, many years later, obviously, if you make a measurement and it confirms your theory, that is nice. But if it disagrees, then you may have made a discovery. The expedition's measurements had led to a discovery, to two great discoveries, in fact. The first was that not only was the Earth not a sphere, as the savants knew, and flattened at the poles, as they already knew, they now discovered that its eccentricity was itself variable. Indeed, the figure of the Earth was not even a curve of revolution. Each meridian was irregular in its own way. This was a new discovery, albeit one which Laplace had hypothesized about before the mission, and the finding gave birth to the new science of geodesy. There was just one problem. This discovery invalidated the core premise of the mission. Because each segment of the meridian had a changing curvature, it was not easy to extrapolate from the French sector to the whole. So after considerable debate, the savants assembled in Paris agreed to incorporate 60-year-old data from the Condamines expedition to Quito, Ecuador, which had measured the Earth's curvature at the equator. Together with Méchain's discrepancy, the result would be that the platinum bar that they created was short by 0.2 millimeters, or the width of two pieces of paper. And it was important that they discussed it, that they disagreed, that they calculated together, and that they coordinated. Because in the end, as Professor Phillips said, this in the end was an artifact. It was a bar that they were in the end creating. But they had to agree about how long to make that bar, and it was the fact that they had the discussions that made that agreement possible. But Méchain, racked with secret guilt, decided to take a second expedition. The idea was for him to extend the meridian measure south of Barcelona to the Balearic Islands and leapfrog past his original readings at Barcelona. And again, everything went wrong. Méchain died of malaria on the Valencia coast in 1804, and only then did his notes and missing Barcelona data find its way back to Delambre, who now faced a decision of his own, whether or not to publish the data. But by this time, Méchain had a new tool to comprehend error, which was the second and even greater discovery due to that assembly. The expedition's attempt to reach a new level of precision prompted the creation of a radically new way to handle scientific data. Among the academicians at the Paris conference was the mathematician André-Marie Legendre. He had been worrying about the data ever since. He and his colleagues had calculated using different techniques, but he couldn't tell for sure or make a clear distinction between how much of the discrepancy was due to observational things, or how much was due to calculational differences, or how much was due to the actual lumpiness of the Earth. Legendre's solution of 1805 was to just suggest that the most plausible curve was the one that minimized the square of the deviations from that curve. In the hands of Laplace and Gauss, this least square method soon became the foundation of modern statistics, a new way to manage error by calling the solution the equation which best fit the data. By 1810, when Delambre published the final volume of his base, he was able to use these new discoveries to explain what Méchain had hidden. For Méchain, precision was an obsession because error represented a moral failure. His honor and his reputation depended on getting the exact result. In that sense, Méchain was not a scientist in the modern sense of that term, but a natural philosopher or a savant, like Newton in the 17th century. And I don't mean to disparage by any means their accomplishments, but it is a different concept of how you do, I think, science than the one that you in this room share today, because that's quite different from how we understand our task. Delambre was a rag merchant's son from Amiens who had begun his study of astronomy quite late. He had smallpox as a child that had blinded him as it could do, but he slowly recovered his sight, which is apparently one of the natural histories of that disease, and he had risen to become the permanent secretary of the Academy of Sciences. Delambre understood that discrepancies of this sort were an inevitable part of observational science, and the goal was to minimize and explain them. In this sense, the study of metrology and the international conference, which debated its findings, inaugurated the modern form of science we know today. To be sure, the attendees also attended gala dinners and enjoyed the amenities of Paris, and at the end of the stay, they held a public ceremony to inaugurate the newly forged platinum bar, which would henceforth define the meter. Each delegate then returned to their homeland with an iron copy of that meter bar to tie their people together with fraternal hands. Unfortunately, once again, war then raged across Europe, and Napoleon, who had welcomed the metric reform, abandoned it. Several decades would pass before France and its neighbors, Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, returned to the metric system. The big push for international measurement standards began in the 1860s, when geodesists realized that the platinum meter bar of 1799 was insufficiently precise to coordinate their findings. This was the golden age of international scientific conferences, when nations began to find it in their interest to collaborate on problems that transcended boundaries, like postage rates, timekeeping, statistical norms, and scientific research. And the surest way to forge agreement on common rules, they discovered, was to argue things out in person. Assembling people proved essential to assembling norms. Scientific conventions require scientific conventions. The most famous of these meetings began in the midst of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and culminated in the Convention du Metre of 1875 and the founding of the Bureau International des Poids et Mesures. This is the event we're celebrating today. It is a history of patience and exactitude, of collaboration amid conflict. It is a story of how an institution born in the shadow of war has enrolled nations in a common project. It is a story of how the newly unified countries of Europe, like Germany and Italy in that era, found it more politic to adopt measures which belong to no one because they belong to everyone. And how the same logic then applied to countries newly liberated from colonial rule in the Americas, and countries which overthrew their own old regimes in Asia and Africa, and countries founded in the dissolution of empires. Even the United States, my home country, the last holdout against the metric system, was an initial signatory to the convention, and in fact, the metric system remains the legal standard there, even if the so-called imperial units are still the ones in common use. But the process of setting standards has never been easy or rapid. Precision measurement is toilsome work. It requires meticulous labor in laboratories mostly invisible to the general public. And the process of negotiating public agreement on such standards is also fraught and laborious. This labor, however, is what makes their resolution reliable. If precision is a virtue, that is because it matches technical exactitude to human coordination. For 150 years, the BIPM has married international collaboration to reliable metrology and reliable metrology to international collaboration. Doing so has involved myriad international meetings with repeated discussions and disagreements, plus the collegial sociability which makes consensus possible. The result has been perhaps our single most enduring monument to human collaboration. So, in the end, Napoleon was right. Conquests will come and go. This work will endure. Thank you.